The HOA started constructing 67 homes on my inherited land, and their plan was simple: steal it. This was the same land where I scattered my grandfather's ashes, but the HOA president just sneered and had security threaten me for trespassing. At the town meeting, they handed me a map carving my family's forest into 67 lots, while the room applauded. So when they thought they had me beat, I just looked at the bulldozers and said, "Go ahead, build it." They saw a broken old man giving up. What they didn't see was their one fatal mistake on an old county map, a mistake that was about to make me the legal owner of their entire project. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And if you believe no power-hungry HOA should ever get away with this, hit subscribe, because you're about to watch 67 brand new houses get a landlord they never saw coming. The noise was wrong. That's the first thing I noticed. Not the usual morning sounds of birds arguing in the pines or the wind rattling the loose pane on the old cabin window. This was a deep, guttural growl that vibrated right up through the floorboards. It was the sound of steel teeth biting into earth, and it was close. Too close. I put my coffee down and walked to the door, my heart already thumping a rhythm I didn't like. Stepping onto the small porch my grandfather built with his own 2 hands, I saw it. Just past my fence line, where the forest should have been a solid wall of green, there was a gash of raw, red dirt. A massive yellow bulldozer was pushing over 60-year-old oak trees like they were weeds. My stomach went hollow. This was my land, all 11 acres of it. My grandfather left it to me, the only thing he really had to give. It wasn't much to look at for most folks, just a patch of untouched woods, a small hunting cabin, and a sliver of a lake. But to me, it was everything. It was where I'd spent summers as a boy learning to track deer and patch a leaky roof. It was where I taught my own daughter, Heather, how to cast a line and bait a hook. It's where I stood, right by that calm water, and scattered my grandfather's ashes, just like he asked. I had plans for this place. Big plans. Now that I was retired, I was going to fix up the cabin, make it a real home. A legacy for Heather and my grandson, a safe place where they could get away from all the noise of the world. And now, the noise of the world was right on my doorstep, tearing it all to shreds. I grabbed my old VA cap, pulled it on tight, and walked toward the chaos. The air smelled of diesel fumes and ripped-up soil. A couple of guys in hard hats were pounding stakes into the ground. A string line stretched between them, cutting a straight, ugly path right across the clearing where I'd planned to plant a vegetable garden. I walked up to the nearest one. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I ask what's going on here?" He didn't even look up, just grunted and hammered another stake into the ground. I tried the other guy. "Excuse me, I own this property. No one told me about any of this." He glanced at me, then looked away, pointing his chin toward a woman standing near a black SUV. "Talk to her," he muttered, and went back to his work. The woman was holding a clipboard like a shield. She wore a pristine white vest with a logo I couldn't quite make out. Designer sunglasses perched on her head despite the morning shade. She looked completely out of place, like she'd been dropped here from a country club luncheon. As I got closer, she looked me up and down, and her mouth tightened into a thin, dismissive line. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with the kind of fake politeness that's more insulting than a curse word. "I hope so," I said. "My name is Randy Keel. I own this land, and you're tearing it apart." She gave a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a friendly sound. "Actually, you're trespassing, sir. This is the future site of the Hidden Pines East Phase 3 expansion." She tapped her clipboard. "And you're interfering with a legally permitted construction project." I felt a hot flush of anger rise up my neck, but I pushed it down. I learned in the Army, you don't win fights by losing your temper. You win them with facts. "There must be a mistake," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "This land has been in my family for 60 years. It was never sold." She smirked, a nasty, self-satisfied little expression. "That's not what our records say." She pulled a radio from her belt. "Tanner, we have a trespasser on site. Please escort this man back to his property line." A big guy in a security polo shirt lumbered over from the SUV. He had mirrored sunglasses and a scowl that looked permanent. He didn't say a word, just put his hand on my arm. I pulled away. "Don't touch me," I said, looking straight at the woman. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer if you disrupt this project again," she called out as the security guard herded me back toward my cabin. "Have a nice day." Back inside, I sat at the rickety kitchen table, the rumble of the machines a constant reminder of the violation happening just a few hundred feet away. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a deep, cold rage. She'd treated me like a crazy old man, a nobody to be brushed aside, disrupted her project. She was disrupting my entire life. But engineers don't panic. They gather data. For the next 2 hours, I turned my grandfather's study upside down. He wasn't a man for banks or fancy lawyers. He kept everything important in a heavy green metal footlocker tucked away in the back of a closet. I blew the dust off it and worked the old combination lock. Inside, under a stack of old photos and service medals, was a thick manila envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it. There it was, the deed. Not a copy, but the original. It was handwritten on heavy, yellowed paper, the ink faded but still perfectly clear. It described the boundaries of the 11-acre parcel, marker by marker, tree by tree. At the bottom was my grandfather's familiar, scrawling signature next to the sellers, and in the corner, a crisp embossed seal from the county clerk's office dated 1962. I ran my thumb over the seal. This was real. This was proof. I found the tax records too, paid in full every year, right up to the present. The zoning classification was stamped right on top, agricultural, residential. There was no mention of a sale, no transfer of title, no eminent domain filing, nothing. The hidden pines. HOA, that woman with her clipboard, her smirking lawyer, they hadn't just made a mistake. They were lying. They had invaded my land, started destroying it, and thought they could get away with it because they had money, and I was just some old man in a cabin. I folded the deed carefully and put it back in the envelope. I walked back out onto the porch and looked at the devastation, the fallen trees, the raw earth. They had started a war. They just didn't know it yet, and they sure as hell didn't know who they were fighting. A week later, I put on a clean shirt, my old VA cap, and drove my dusty Ford Ranger into the heart of Hidden Pines East. It was like entering another world. The lawns were a perfect manicured green that looked more like plastic than grass. Every house was a slightly different shade of beige, with identical mailboxes standing at attention. The place felt sterile, controlled. The clubhouse was at the center of it all, a big, imposing building with white columns that tried to look like old money, but just looked new. I walked in carrying the manila envelope with the deed inside. The meeting was already underway in a conference room with a long, polished table. Cheryl Ramsey sat at the head of it, looking smug and important. The other board members, a collection of men and women with the same tense, self-satisfied look, flanked her. About 20 other homeowners were seated in chairs along the walls. I found an empty seat in the back and waited. They droned on about landscaping violations and holiday decoration policies for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Cheryl announced the new business portion of the agenda. I stood up. "My name is Randy Keel," I said, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the quiet room. "I'd like to address the board about the construction project on the north side of the development." Cheryl's eyes narrowed, but she put on a tight, fake smile. "Mr. Keel, this isn't the proper forum for individual grievances." I held up the envelope. "This isn't a grievance, it's a point of fact. The land you're building on belongs to me." A low murmur rippled through the room. I walked to the table and laid the original deed down in front of her. "This is the deed to the 11-acre parcel your bulldozers are on. It was deeded to my grandfather in 1962. It was never sold." I looked around the room, making eye contact with the other homeowners. I kept my voice soft, steady. "That land is more than just dirt to me. It's where my grandfather taught me to work with my hands. It's where I taught my daughter to fish. My family's history is there. I had planned to fix up the old cabin, leave something behind for my grandson. I'm not asking for a fight. I'm just asking you to look at the facts and stop destroying my property." I could see a flicker of understanding in some of the older faces in the room. A couple of them nodded slightly, looking uncomfortable. For a second, I thought it might actually work. I thought reason and decency might win. That was my mistake. Cheryl didn't even glance at the deed. "Thank you for your story, Mr. Keel," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But this is not relevant to today's agenda." She pushed the deed back toward me with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. A young man in a suit I'm sure cost more than my truck stood up beside her. He had a smooth, confident face and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Sir," he began, calling me sir in a way that made it feel like an insult. "My name is Greg Landon. I represent the HOA. I can assure you that all proper legal channels were followed. The property in question was subject to a quiet title action that was resolved in court last year. Furthermore, the county has granted all necessary permits under the principles of eminent domain for community development." He said the words like they were a magic spell designed to shut down any argument, but I knew what they meant. I also knew he was lying. There was no court action, no eminent domain. It was just fancy talk to scare me. Before I could respond, he nodded to an assistant who unrolled a large, color-printed map on the table. My heart sank. It was my land, my forest, my clearing, my piece of the lake, but it was all carved up. 67 little boxes, each one a different color, each one with a number. They had turned my grandfather's legacy into a spreadsheet. "This is the approved plat for Phase 3, Cheryl announced proudly. "As you can see, every lot is accounted for." The room was silent. I just stared at the map, at the complete and total erasure of my life's one safe place. I felt the hope I'd walked in with drain right out of me, leaving a cold, heavy emptiness behind. "Therefore," Cheryl continued, her voice sharp and final, "the board will now vote on a motion to formally restrict Mr. Keel's access to the active construction zone for his own safety and the safety of the workers." She looked around the table. "All in favor?" Every single hand went up. "The motion passes unanimously." And then the room started clapping. Not all of them, but most. Clapping for the theft of my land, clapping for my public humiliation. It was a surreal, soul-crushing moment. As I stood there, stunned, my eyes locked with one man across the room. He was older than me, maybe in his 70s, with calloused hands and a weathered face. He was still wearing a hard hat, like he'd come straight from a job site. He wasn't clapping. He just looked at me, held my gaze for a long moment, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a sign that at least one person in that room knew a raw deal when he saw one. I picked up my grandfather's deed from the table, folded it carefully, and put it back in the envelope. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked out of that clubhouse, the sound of their applause following me. I walked all the way to the edge of my property, to the new fence line they'd started putting up. The bulldozers were still growling, still tearing into the earth. I watched them for a long time, the cold rage inside me slowly cooling, hardening into something else, something solid, something patient. They thought they had won. They thought the old man in the VA cap was beaten. I looked out over the noise and the destruction, at the kingdom of mud and splintered wood. They were building on a foundation of lies. And I said it, just loud enough for myself to hear. "Go ahead, build it." The town meeting was a declaration of war. I just didn't realize they'd be the ones to fire the first shots so quickly. 2 days later, a crew arrived and installed a 10-foot-high chain-link fence, topped with angled barbed wire, cutting me off completely from my own woods. At the entrance, they erected a heavy iron gate with a keypad lock, and standing beside it from dawn till dusk was Tanner, the HOA's security goon. He'd park his white pickup truck, sit there in his mirrored sunglasses, and watch my cabin. He never waved, never acknowledged me. He just watched. It was a clear message. You are not welcome here. The psychological war began right after. The letters started arriving in thick, cream-colored envelopes, delivered by certified mail, so I had to sign for them. The first was a formal notice of restricted access, printed on heavy paper with the Hidden Pines East logo embossed in gold at the top. It cited the board's unanimous vote and warned that any attempt to enter the designated construction zone would be considered criminal trespassing. The next one, a week later, was an invoice. $500 for unauthorized surveillance of a private project, whatever that meant. I'd been sitting on my own porch with a pair of binoculars watching them. Apparently, looking at my own land was now a billable offense. Then came the threats from their lawyer, Greg Landon. He sent a cease and desist letter, full of fancy words that boiled down to one thing: shut up and stay away, or we will sue you into oblivion. He mentioned the potential for an injunction, a lien against my cabin, all sorts of legal boogeymen designed to scare an old man into submission. I didn't throw them away. I didn't get angry. I bought a new accordion file, labeled it HOA, and slid each letter inside, carefully noting the date it was received. Every threat, every bogus fine, was another piece of evidence. While they were busy sending paper threats, Cheryl was celebrating online. My daughter, Heather, found her Facebook page. It was public, of course. Cheryl wanted everyone to see what a powerful and effective leader she was. She posted daily updates, posing in a spotless hard hat with a triumphant smile, the ravaged landscape behind her. "So proud of the progress our team is making on Phase 3, she'd write. "Building a stronger, more beautiful community for our families." Underneath, there would be dozens of glowing comments from other residents. I had Heather screenshot every single post, every picture, every comment. Cheryl was so busy building her legacy in public, she was handing me a perfect record of her arrogance. Meanwhile, I kept walking my property line, the part they hadn't fenced off yet. I've walked that line 1,000 times. I know the dip in the earth by the old lightning-struck pine, the cluster of granite rocks near the creek, and I started noticing things. Small things. One of their survey stakes, a thin piece of wood with a bright pink ribbon, had been moved. It was about 5 feet closer to my cabin than it was the week before. The next day I found another one moved. They were subtly, systematically trying to shrink my property, stake by stake, as if they could physically move the boundary if they just wished for it hard enough. Then came the cameras. They mounted 2 of them on tall poles just inside their new fence line, both pointing directly at my cabin. They weren't watching their own construction site. They were watching me. It was pure intimidation. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning. I went out to get the mail, and tucked inside my mailbox, underneath a circular for a pizza place, was a plain white envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, Randy, written in hurried block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of an internal HOA memo. It was a summary from their lawyer, Greg Landon, to the board, dated the week before the town meeting. I read it 3 times. My hands started to shake. The memo talked about the title search on my land. It said, and I'll never forget the phrase, there was a significant gray area regarding the ownership claim. It confirmed the title was still officially in my family's name and that no court-ordered transfer had ever been finalized. It recommended the HOA pause the project to resolve the potential ownership conflict. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Cheryl to the rest of the board. Her looping, arrogant handwriting was unmistakable. "Progress can't wait for paperwork," it said. "We proceed as planned." There it was. The smoking gun. They knew the land wasn't legally theirs, and they decided to take it anyway. They were counting on me being too old, too tired, or too poor to fight back. A quiet rage settled deep in my bones. It wasn't hot anymore. It was cold and hard, like steel. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't sit on the porch and watch them. I went to my workshop, the one my grandfather built. I flipped on the overhead lights, the smell of sawdust and engine oil filling the air. I walked past the lathes and the drill presses to the corner where an old, heavy-duty post-hole auger was sitting, covered in a dusty tarp. Its engine was seized, the blades rusted. I pulled the tarp off, ran my hand over the cold metal. They had their lawyers, their maps, and their meetings. They thought they were the builders, but they forgot one thing. I build stuff. I took out my tools, and under the bare bulb, I began to bring the old machine back to life. The anonymous memo confirmed they were arrogant. Now, I needed to prove they were incompetent. Wars aren't won with just one bullet, and the deed alone wasn't enough. They had lawyers who could tie that up in court for years, bleeding me dry. I needed something more, something undeniable, something that would make their entire project collapse like a house of cards. An old army buddy once told me, every big operation has a single point of failure. I just needed to find theirs. And I had a hunch it was buried in paperwork. The next morning, I got in my truck and drove 3 hours east to the county seat, a sleepy town with an old stone courthouse at its center. I bypassed the main clerk's office and went straight down to the basement, to the county archives and records department. It was a quiet, musty-smelling place, filled with massive rolling shelves and heavy-bound ledgers. A woman with glasses on a chain looked up from her desk. I told her I needed to see all the property plats and survey maps for my parcel from 1975 to the present day. She gave me a quizzical look, but shuffled off into the stacks. An hour later, she wheeled out a cart stacked high with rolled-up maps and thick binders. I spent the rest of the day there, surrounded by the smell of old paper and dust, carefully unrolling each map on a large, brightly lit table. I went through them one by one, tracing the boundary lines with my finger, comparing the surveyor's notes from each decade. Most of it was exactly as I expected, but then I found it. In a folder dated 1979, there was a document titled Boundary Line Adjustment and Easement Correction. My heart started to beat a little faster. In the late 70s, the county had widened the old state road that ran along the western edge of my grandfather's property. To do it, they had purchased a small 20-foot wide strip of land from him. It wasn't much, but the adjustment had shifted his entire western boundary line. A new survey was done. New markers were set, and a new official plat was filed. It was all there, stamped and signed. Then I pulled out the map Cheryl's lawyer had so proudly unrolled at the meeting, a copy of which they had helpfully mailed to me with one of their threatening letters. I laid it next to the official 1979 plat. My hands went completely still. They didn't match. Cheryl's architect hadn't used the updated official plat. He'd used an old one, a pre-1979 version. A sloppy, lazy mistake. And because of that one mistake, their entire calculation was wrong. Every single one of their 67 lots wasn't just touching my property. Their build wasn't just encroaching on my land by a few feet, it was straddling it. The entire Phase 3 development, every planned foundation, every street, every sewer line, was located 100% inside my legal property line. They didn't own a single inch of the ground they were building on. I felt a slow grin spread across my face. This was it. This was their single point of failure. I knew what I had to do next, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed a professional, someone the county would listen to. I asked the archivist if she knew any old-school land surveyors, and she recommended a man named Wallace Denton. "Wally's retired," she said, "but if there's a boundary dispute, he's the one you want. Knows this county's dirt better than anyone." I found Wally's number and called him. He had a gruff, gravelly voice and wasn't impressed by my story until I mentioned the 1979 boundary adjustment. There was a pause on the line. "Meet me at the property tomorrow morning," he said, and hung up. He showed up in a beat-up Toyota pickup that looked even older than mine, a grizzled man in his 70s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He didn't say much. He just walked the perimeter, took out his instruments, and got to work. I showed him the old rusted iron pin marking the original corner of my grandfather's land, half buried under a century of fallen leaves. Wally took his readings, consulted his own dog-eared maps, and then looked at the HOA's survey stakes. He let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he chuckled, shaking his head. "They used the old plat, the one before the highway came through." He looked over at the construction site, where crews were now pouring concrete foundations. A slow, mischievous smile spread across his weathered face. "Oh, this is going to be good." For the next 2 days, Wally and I worked quietly. He conducted a full official resurvey of my entire 11 acres, meticulously documenting every boundary marker, every angle, every inch. He was a master at his craft, and it was a pleasure to watch him. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity that I respected. When he was done, he drafted a new plat, a beautiful, precise document that overlaid his survey on top of the HOA's construction plans. The picture it painted was devastating. There was no gray area. It was black and white. Their entire development was trespassing. Together we drove back to the county courthouse. This time, we didn't go to the basement. We went straight to the clerk's office on the main floor. We filed a formal boundary affidavit and a notice of ownership, attaching Wally's certified survey as irrefutable proof. The documents were stamped, recorded, and became a matter of public record. Legally, the world now knew that the land Hidden Pines East was building on belonged to me. The clerk asked if we wanted to serve a notice to the HOA. I looked at Wally. Wally looked at me. "Not yet," I said. Out in the hallway, Wally clapped me on the shoulder. "So what's the plan now, Randy? You gonna shut them down?" I looked out the courthouse window toward home. I could almost hear the sound of their hammers and saws, the beeping of the trucks as they backed up to pour more concrete. They were so proud of their progress, so confident. "No, Wally," I said, a feeling of calm certainty settling over me. "I'm going to let them finish. Patience is a weapon. In the Army, you learn that waiting for the right moment is just as important as pulling the trigger." So I waited. Weeks turned into a couple of months. Over the fence, a small city was rising from the dirt. First came the foundations, then the wooden skeletons of houses, then the roofs and windows. Every day I watched them work, adding millions of dollars in lumber, wiring, and plumbing to my land. And every day, the HOA's harassment got worse. It was like they sensed their time was running out and were trying to break me before the end came. They accused me of flying a drone over their secure site, sending another fine for $500. I didn't even own a drone. Then they claimed someone had cut the power lines to their construction office one night, and Tanner, their security chief, had the gall to come knock on my door and ask where I was at 2 a.m. I told him I was asleep and that if he set foot on my porch again without a warrant, I'd have him arrested for trespassing. The smug look on his face faltered for a second, but he just grunted and walked away. They were getting desperate, making up new rules and new reasons to fine me, trying to build a paper trail that would paint me as a troublesome crank. I just filed every letter away with the others. The worst part was what it did to my daughter, Heather. She'd come out on weekends with my grandson to help me around the cabin. It was our time together, but the constant presence of the construction, the surveillance cameras pointed at us, Tanner watching from his truck, it was wearing her down. One Saturday, we were in the small garden behind the cabin. My late wife had planted a row of heirloom tomato plants there years ago, and Heather had carefully nurtured them ever since. They were special to her. We were staking them up when a huge gravel truck, driving way too fast down. The new road they'd built took the turn too wide. The driver lost control for a second, and the back end of the truck swung out, dumping a ton of sharp gray gravel right over our little fence and all over the garden. It crushed everything. The tomato plants were buried, the stems snapped, the soil contaminated. Heather just stood there, staring. Then her shoulders started to shake, and she began to cry. Not loud, sobbing cries, but quiet, hopeless tears that were so much worse. "Dad, this is too much," she whispered, her voice choked with grief. "Look at what they're doing. They're not going to stop. Maybe we should just sell, take their money and go somewhere else. It's not worth this fight. We've already lost." Seeing her like that, seeing her hope break, was worse than any threat or fine they could send me. It was the closest I came to giving up. That night, I sat alone in my grandfather's worn-out armchair in the cabin, the same chair he'd died in. The smell of sawdust and old books hung in the air. For a long, dark hour, I actually considered it. Selling, just ending the stress, letting them win. Heather's safety, her peace of mind, was more important than any piece of land. I could walk away, and maybe that would be its own kind of victory. But then I thought about my grandfather, a man who never backed down from a bully in his life. I thought about the promise I'd made to preserve this place for my own grandson. Selling wouldn't be a victory. It would be teaching my family that when powerful people push you, you run. And I wasn't going to teach them that. Just as I was stealing my resolve, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a gravelly voice said, "Randy, it's Wally." I sat up straight. "It's time," he said. I didn't need to ask what he meant. The next day, I drove into town and peeked at Cheryl's Facebook page from the library computer. There it was. A glossy photo of a fully built house, complete with a perfect lawn and a big red "Sold" sign in the front yard. Cheryl stood next to it, beaming, holding a giant pair of ceremonial scissors. The caption read, "Congratulations to the first family of Hidden Pines East, Phase 3. Welcome to the neighborhood. Move-in day is this Saturday." The comments were full of champagne emojis and exclamation points. They had done it. They'd built their kingdom on my land. Streets were paved, houses were staged with brand new furniture, and families were about to move in. They thought the fight was over. I looked at the picture of Cheryl, at her triumphant, smug smile. A slow, calm smile spread across my own face. It wasn't triumph she was feeling. It was the blissful ignorance of an enemy who has no idea the ground is about to fall out from under their feet. I didn't post a comment. I didn't call my lawyer. I just picked up my phone and made one quiet call to a local title insurance company. The storm was finally ready to break. The first move had to be silent. While Cheryl was busy planning a ribbon-cutting ceremony, I was at the courthouse with a quiet bulldog of a real estate lawyer Wally had recommended. We didn't sue the HOA. Suing them would have been a public declaration of war, and I wasn't ready to show my hand. Instead, we filed a simple lawsuit to quiet title. It's a legal move that essentially asks a judge to clear up any confusion about who owns a piece of property. But we weren't just asking the judge to confirm my ownership of the 11-acre parcel. We were asking the judge to confirm my legal ownership over the 67 newly created subdivision lots that now sat on top of it. It was a subtle, devastating distinction. The paperwork was filed, the case was sealed for the time being, and the HOA had no idea what was coming. The second move had to be loud. The families buying these new homes were innocent. They were victims in this just as much as I was. They deserved to know who they were really dealing with before they signed their lives away. So, I rented the small ballroom at the local hotel for a Wednesday evening. It wasn't cheap, but it was an investment in the truth. Then my lawyer sent out 67 letters via certified mail, one to every new homeowner who had a contract, and one to every prospective buyer the realtor would give us the name of. The envelope was plain, but the first line of the letter was not. It read, "Urgent, ownership dispute and public information. Session regarding all lots in the Hidden Pines, East Phase 3 development. Your attendance is strongly advised." The night of the meeting, the room was buzzing. It was packed. There were young couples holding hands, looking nervous. There were real estate agents in sharp suits, looking annoyed. And right in the front row, looking like a queen holding court, was Cheryl Ramsey, flanked by her lawyer Greg Landon and a few other HOA board members. They were all whispering and smirking, clearly expecting me to make some last pathetic plea. They thought they were there to watch me lose one final time. I had arranged for a few key people to be there. Wally was sitting quietly in the back, a calm presence. I'd also invited a senior official from the county assessor's office, a woman named Ms. Albright, and the head of the title insurance company I had spoken to. They were just sitting in the audience like everyone else. I walked up to the podium at the front of the room, holding a simple file folder. The murmuring died down. Every eye was on me. I looked at Cheryl. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a look of impatient disdain. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady. "My name is Randy Keel. I won't take much of your time. I know you're all here because you're excited about your new homes, but there's some information you need to have. Information the Hidden Pines HOA has deliberately kept from you." Greg Landon, the lawyer, jumped to his feet. "Objection," he said, as if we were in a courtroom. "This is a private matter, and this forum is entirely inappropriate." I just ignored him. "Ms. Ramsey and her board have been telling you they own the land you're building on. They are lying." A gasp went through the room. Cheryl's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. She started to stand up, but before she could speak, I said, "I don't expect you to take my word for it." I turned and gestured toward the woman from the assessor's office. "Ms. Albright, would you be willing to confirm the county's official record of ownership for this parcel?" Ms. Albright stood up, a no-nonsense woman in a sensible suit. She held a thick file. "I can," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the room. According to the official certified plat filed by surveyor Wallace Denton and recorded on October 12th, the entire parcel designated for the Phase 3 development, including all 67 lots, is the sole private property of Mr. Randolph Keel. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. It was as if all the air had been sucked out. People turned to stare at Cheryl, whose mouth was hanging open. She looked like she'd been struck by lightning. She turned to her lawyer, but he just stood there, his own face as white as a sheet. I laid my grandfather's original deed on the podium. Then I put Wally's certified survey next to it. Then I turned on the projector and displayed the satellite overlays, showing the pre-1979 map they used versus the actual legal boundary line. The proof was undeniable, laid out for everyone to see. I turned back to the audience, my voice ringing with an authority they had never heard from me before. I looked straight at Cheryl, locking her in my gaze. You didn't just trespass on my land, I said, my voice low and cold. You didn't just take my forest, you built your entire kingdom on it. And now, every last board, every nail, and every blade of grass belongs to me. The hotel ballroom erupted. It wasn't anger at me, it was fury directed at Cheryl. People were shouting questions, demanding answers. The realtors looked like they'd seen a ghost, their multi-million-dollar commission checks vanishing before their eyes. Cheryl, for her part, completely lost it. She started yelling that my documents were fake, that I was a con artist, that this was all some elaborate fraud, but the tide had turned. Nobody was listening to her anymore. They were listening to the woman from the county assessor's office. They were looking at the maps. They were looking at me. Greg Landon, the slick lawyer, grabbed her by the arm and practically dragged her out of the room as a local news reporter who I'd tipped off started snapping pictures. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the HOA. Cheryl's desperate attempts to control the narrative just made things worse. The anonymous memo from her own lawyer, the one admitting they knew there was an ownership conflict, was leaked to the news station. Then came a flood of emails, leaked by a terrified contractor, showing Cheryl bullying him to speed up construction and forging approval dates on permits. She had built her kingdom on stolen land, and now the walls were caving in. The HOA, now in full-blown panic mode, tried to buy their way out of the disaster. A new lawyer, a serious-looking older man, called me. He didn't make threats. He offered a settlement, a very generous one. They offered to buy my land, all of it, for 3 times its market value. "Just name your price, Mr. Keel," he said. It was tempting. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. I could have taken it, moved away, and let them have their mess. But it was never just about the money. It was about the principle. "It's not for sale," I told him. "But," I added, letting the silence hang on the line for a moment, "I might be willing to discuss a lease. First, you need to understand something. You want to buy my land back? Start with a public apology, a real one, from Cheryl Ramsey herself." He knew, and I knew, that would never happen. The story exploded in our small community. The local news ran a segment every night for a week. They interviewed me and Wally down by the lake, my grandfather's cabin in the background. The reporter asked how we proved it. Wally, in his usual gruff way, just pointed to the boundary markers. "Wasn't hard," he grunted. "You just got to do the work. They did a sloppy copy job. We did a survey." The camera loved him. He was the picture of old-school, no-nonsense competence. The HOA called one final emergency meeting at the clubhouse. This time, the room wasn't full of supporters clapping for Cheryl. It was packed with angry homeowners, both the new ones whose lives were in limbo, and the old ones who finally saw the board for what it was. The man who'd nodded at me at that first meeting, the Vietnam vet, was there. He walked right up to me and shook my hand. "Gave 'em hell, Randy," he said. "Good on ya." The meeting was chaos. The board members couldn't answer any questions. They just stammered and looked at their shoes. Halfway through, 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies walked into the clubhouse. They walked straight up to Cheryl Ramsey, who was trying to hide in the back, and served her with a summons. She was being investigated for civil fraud and was formally charged with repeated trespassing. The look on her face, the complete and utter shock of real consequences finally arriving at her door, was a sight I will never forget. She was booed out of the room. The rest of the board resigned on the spot. Their little kingdom had officially crumbled. I waited for the room to quiet down, then I walked to the front. "I know everyone here is worried," I said. "You've been lied to. You've put your life savings into homes that technically right now are just unauthorized structures on my property. But I didn't do all this to kick families out onto the street." I looked around. At the faces of the new homeowners, their expressions a mixture of fear and hope. "Here's my proposal. We're going to form a new housing co-op, a real one, run by the residents for the residents. You'll lease the land your home sits on directly from me. The fee will be half of what the HOA was charging you, and I can promise you there will be no fines for the wrong color mailbox, no Karens measuring your grass with a ruler." A wave of relief washed over the room. People started clapping, but this time, the applause felt different. It was real. It was grateful. "There's just one condition," I said, my voice firm. I looked toward the door where Cheryl had just been escorted out. "You don't have to leave, but she does." A cheer went up. It was over. A few weeks later, the old Hidden Pines East sign came down. The iron gate was taken off its hinges and sold for scrap. I walked through the new neighborhood, my neighborhood, and watched as kids played on lawns they now knew were safe. I still had the cabin by the lake, and now I had 67 new families who treated me not as an outsider, but as the man who had saved their homes. My daughter Heather helped me plant a new tomato garden, right where the old one had been crushed. The land was still my family's legacy. It just got a little bigger than I'd planned,